Welcome to Writers on Writing with your host, Dr. Brenda Greene, Executive Director of the Center for Black Literature at Medgar Evers College. This is a very special edition of Writers on Writing. I'm very, very pleased to be taping this interview with the Honorable Mayor Dinkins. Mayor Dinkins, and thank you so much for granting me this interview with you.
It's good to see you again.
Good to see you too, and I'm really, really honored to be able to talk to you about your incredible book and your incredible life story. And I think I was really impressed with this book because it was really such a candid portrayal of you over the last 7 decades. I thought about it.
Yeah, I'm kind of old. I tell people if you're closer to 90 than you are to 80, you're old. So.
Well, I think of you as being a wise elder, and your story really needs to be told to many young people, and you have a very strong message. But before we begin, I'd just like to share with our audience some information about you. You were the 106th mayor of the city of New York and the first African American mayor, but you began your public service in 1966. You also were president of the New York City Board of Elections. You served as city clerk for 10 years before being elected to as president of the Borough of Manhattan, and then of course of the mayor of New York. And while there, you instituted a number of outstanding programs, including the Safe City Cops and Kids. You were founding the Beacon programs, areas homelessness programs and social services. You're a founding member of the Black and Puerto Rican Legislative Caucus, the Council of Black Elected of Democrats of New York City, the 100 Black Men, Vice President of the United States Conference of Mayors. You serve on the board of a number of nonprofit and charitable organizations, including the Children's Health Fund, the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund, the Posse Foundation, the Coalition for the Homeless. You're chairman emeritus of the National Black Leadership Commission on AIDS and the Constituency for Africa. You're on the steering committee of the New York Urban League Advisory Council, and so on. So many things that I'm going to stop there. Of course, you're an alumnus of Howard University, and then the Brooklyn Law cannot, and you're going to mention this anyway, a longtime resident of Harlem, and you live with your bride.
61 years.
61 years. You have 2 children, David Jr. and Donna Dinkins Hargett, and 2 grandchildren. And so that's just a brief portrait, just a very, very brief portrait of your life. But I want to heard about your life. You have your weekly radio show.
Yeah, no more. I used to. They sold the station, WLIB.
That's right.
So I'm not there any longer, but I really did enjoy it. It's a lot of fun. Thanks to Percy Sutton.
One of the 4.
Gang of 4.
The gang of 4.
See, Percy was the oldest, and then Basil, then me, and then Charlie Rangel. And Percy and Basil are gone. And I'm just now beginning to get to the point where I can talk about Basil Patterson and Bill Lynch without getting very emotional.
Okay.
They meant so much to me. Whereas Percy meant a lot as well, but have more time since we, like I can talk about Nelson Mandela because he's one of my heroes also, but he's long gone, or Paul Robeson. And I don't get too emotional, but boy, to try to talk about Basil or Bill Lynch.
Why don't we start there, because they had a major impact on your leadership and your development over the years, even beginning with the New York State Assembly legislature, and all of those ended up contributing to the kind of a public servant you were. Why don't we talk a little bit about how they helped to influence and mentor you and help you to shape and determine what you wanted to do as
Well,
mayor?
Percy and I were in the assembly at the same time, and another person, a great Brooklynite, Shirley Chisholm. We were there together, and in 1965, before I came, there was a contest on who should become the Speaker of the Assembly. And of course, the Speaker is determined by a vote of all of the members of the Assembly. And the two top people were Stanley Steingut and Tony Travia, each of Brooklyn. And they couldn't agree, and the state stood still for maybe 30 days. And then Nelson Rockefeller, a Republican governor, got Republican assemblymen to vote for Tony Travia, and he became Speaker.
Right.
Now that next year, 1966, Percy Sutton said, let's go talk to the Speaker and explain to him that we're politicians too. We got to go home with something. So if you give me a little poetic license, envision there was an expanded assembly in '66. Instead of 150 members, there were 165, which
Right.
frankly is how I had an opportunity to run for a seat. So we go into Tony Travia in the DeWitt Clinton Hotel, which is where the Democrats stayed in Albany. And if you envision, say, 90 Democrats, and then say 9 of them are black, and you subtract 9 from half of 165, in other words, without our votes, they don't have a majority.
Right.
And Percy and Shirley and Basil Patterson, who was in the Senate, Charlie Rangel, who was worked in the Speaker's legal staff, part of the Speaker's legal staff. We said to Tony, we got to go home with something. And so the Sikh program was born that night.
Right. You were. That's one of the things I found out. You're a founding member of the Sikh program.
But it was because of that effort. And then the next year, I had no seat for which I could run because the term was only 1 year. But I was hopelessly hooked on public service from that moment on. I didn't want to do anything but that. And so I worked hard at trying to, I was a district leader for 20 years. I got, we had the good fortune of being in a club with Ray Jones, J. Raymond Jones, known as the Harlem Fox. And it was he who gave me this opportunity to run for the assembly in the first place. And so in 1977, Percy said he was going to run for mayor. Well, no black man had ever run for, you kidding me? This city of 8 million plus people, a black man going to be mayor? And Percy said, yeah. I said, well, what about borough president? Because Percy was borough president of Manhattan. He said, well, you should do that. I suspected Percy told 2 or 3 other people the same thing. But so I ran for Manhattan Borough President in 1977, and there were 4 of us, and I finished 3rd. And then 4 years later, I ran again, and I came pretty close to winning against Andrew Stein. And then the next year, next time, Stein decided to run for a different office.
I know. And so that was one of the things that I was just amazed at the persistence. But I just want to go back for a minute to your time in the Assembly, because you were also the founding member of the Black and Puerto Rican legislative.
Yeah, all that was born, that you're right, all that was born that night when we visited Tony Travia. We recognized that we should come together in as a group, and we did. And I love to tell people the story of how Percy used to say to us, you can't dance every set,
Right.
but we pick our moments.
Right.
There was a fellow named Ken Brown from Queens who was had been a district attorney. In those days, we didn't have microphones in the assembly chamber. And Ken would rise in the back. He was way up in the top. And he would say, "Mr. Speaker, the member yield to a question." And of course, the answer is always in the affirmative. And then Ken would start off always antagonistic. He's questioning the man speaking, the member speaking. And he would start off with, "Do you mean to tell me?" And then when he got through, Percy, who was down in the well in seat number 1, Percy would rise and say, "Mr. Speaker," and will the member yield to a question? Of course he would. And then Percy would say, "Walk in my shoes. I come from the village of Harlem."
You're saying the village of Harlem back then.
When he got through, you could hear a pin drop.
Okay.
And they talk about good cop, bad cop. They were excellent at it.
Right.
So I learned a lot from Percy Sutton in those days, and it was of an enormous benefit to me. I say to young people today, everybody stands on somebody's shoulders. And the man that's on third base and thinks he's there because he hit a triple, he did wrong. He's there because people pushed him around those bases.
Right.
And
well, that's part of what I wanted to be able to stress is you said you stand on many shoulders. And I just want to highlight just some of the major accomplishments you had once you became mayor. You ran for borough president. I could not believe that you would run 3 times. I mean, to have that persistence and that drive, and I mean, your ego, I mean, you were able to let go and to just keep going. And you know what I do after reading your book? Sometimes as I face difficult decisions, I said, what would Mayor Dinkins have done? Because you're very persistent and strategic and, okay, it's not going to work this time. Let me think about another way. What's going to happen? What's happening behind the scenes? Yeah.
well, I was fortunate in that I had a lot of people to help me. And see, I have never ever maintained that I was the smartest guy in the room.
And you talk about your wife being smarter, right?
Oh, my bride, yes, Lord.
Yes.
And because I had the good fortune of having so many friends and people who assisted me, once in office we were able to get some things done. And I'm very proud of our record. And I say our record, and I'm not being modest, it was the accomplishment of a lot of people.
Right. And you give credit to those people.
Oh yeah, well that was part of the reason for writing a book.
Right.
And had it not been for Len Riggio, who owns Barnes and Noble, and they didn't publish the book, but he assisted me greatly in getting it done, helping me to find a co-writer and getting somebody else to publish it, and he was a great guy. Len Riggio is one of the nicest, most decent people I know. He built a chapel on Haley Farm, which is where Marion Wright Edelman is, and he built this chapel and insisted that it be named not just for him, but for Bill Lynch. He loved Bill Lynch. So the chapel is the Leonard Riggio and William Lynch Jr. chapel. I think that's the...
And that's part of what you do in this book is talk about the importance of legacy.
Oh, yeah.
And of thinking about what your legacy will be. But let me just share what happened under your watch as mayor. The New York Police Department was expanded by more than 6,000 cops. The toughest gun control laws in the nation were enacted. The city's first needle exchange program was created, which helped to reduce the spread of AIDS.
Well, let me tell you about needle exchange.
Okay.
When my staff came into me and tried to persuade me that we should support a needle exchange program, I said, wait a minute, you mean you're going to give free needles to drug addicts?
Mm-hmm.
They said, yeah. I said, you know, I ain't too big on methadone.
Right.
And they said, in effect, sit down, Mr. Mayor, and listen. It took them a couple of weeks overall, but they persuaded me that it made sense, because one, it would reduce the spread of AIDS, because they would have clean needles instead of contaminated needles, and a small percentage, maybe 1%, maybe 2%, who were drug addicts would get off of drugs because they learned about the various programs they were. Now today, it's no big deal. Today, everybody says, oh, needle exchange makes a lot of sense. But it was people like people who are on our staff, like Dr. Marguerite Hill. That's an interesting woman. She's a black lesbian who became the head of the gay men's health crisis. You know, that's something. But she's terrific.
Okay.
She's terrific. And Deborah Frazier Howes, who wasn't in our administration but worked very closely with us. And Deborah, she's the founder of the National Black Leadership Commission on AIDS. Talked me into becoming the chairman for about 5 or 6 years.
Because when you came into office, it was rapid. The AIDS.
Oh yeah.
It was really an epidemic.
Oh yeah, sure it was.
And then also the homeless population. Share with us what
well,
you did about
let me
that.
tell you, when we were in our president's office, we had several issue areas. Each was headed by a woman. Not because we said it'll look good if we have a woman. They just were the best. And there was a woman, Nancy Waxstein, headed up the group that dealt with homeless, and we produced a book called "A Shelter Is Not a Home." But sad to say, today, in 2014, we have more homeless than we ever had since they started keeping records. That's sad to say. But homelessness, by definition, means you don't have a home.
Right, and you had to combat the way that the previous administration had handled the homelessness. But just share, if you can think about some of the strategies that you used to really combat that. It's grown again, and that's I think that's more of a reflection of the administration and gentrification and what's happening now. But what are some specific strategies that you used under your watch that carried over? Initially carried over.
Well, among other things, we recognize that some people who are homeless, they're not homeless for the same reason. Maybe one person is homeless because he's a drug addict or an alcoholic. But a lot of people are hard-working folks. Some people who had jobs were homeless.
And that's today, too.
Sure it is.
Right.
And it's a sad commentary, but it's unfortunate that too few of us recognize how important it is that we care about the least among us. And Dr. King said we'll one day be judged by how we treat the least among us. And so one has to care about the homeless, and there are many very fine people who have fallen on hard times for one reason or another.
Right, and you recognize that. Yeah, that was part of your style. You had a very
children.
different style. And education.
Yeah, I'm a nut for kids. I love children. And so when we talk about homeless families, you have to envision a mother, maybe a single mother, with 2 or 3 children. She had one in her arms and holding on to 2 or 3 others. And unfortunately, there was, in the past, there was an administration that would deem some people like that to be ineligible for a stay in a shelter even. And they said, well, where'd you stay last night? Why don't you go back there? But last night they stayed with you, and your family said, that's it, they got to get out of here.
Right.
And so it's sad that there are too many of us who don't care about others. Right. And I like people who like people, who care about people, especially children.
So that was your style. And you had a style that tried to negotiate, but you had some challenges too, of course.
Yeah,
And
well,
unfortunately, that's too many people focus on that.
well, when you spoke about our Safe Streets, Safe City program,
Yes,
which was subtitled Cops and Kids.
right,
Now, we had this plan to produce more police officers, which meant automatically you needed more related things. If you have more cops, you need more assistant DAs, more legal aid, more probation, more parole, and so forth. So you need a lot of money. Where are you going to get that money? New York City doesn't have the right to tax itself other than real estate rates. You have to go to Albany to get permission to tax. And so when we went to Albany, Milt Mullen, who had been the presiding justice of the appellate division, the second department, based here in Brooklyn, and Milt, he said, "I'll give you 2 years." He resigned from the bench to come with me, and we went to Albany and we talked to a white Republican senator from Queens. And when I said, "People are dying in the street," he said, "Mr. Mayor, my constituency is concerned with auto theft and graffiti."
wow,
I hit the ceiling. But so it was not easily done. It took a lot of work. But it was because of people like Milt Mullen that we got it done.
right,
And George Daniels. George Daniels is today a federal judge. He resigned from the criminal court bench to become my counsel. I had a lot of good people. A man who was here at Medgar Evers, Wally Ford.
yes,
He was one of my commissioners, a brilliant guy, did a lot of wonderful work. And so we had a program on women and minority-owned businesses. And thanks to Wally Ford and George Daniels and some others, we were able to get this done. And we said in the veterans were often given a preference. And so that's what we did. We treated these situations like that. You had, of course, established that you were, in fact, a minority. You couldn't have a black face backing
right.
a white group. But Wally was tremendous at that.
Well,
And we were successful.
those are the stories that people need to hear. We're coming to a close, and as we come to a close, I want to go to the area around race relationships. You always focused on the gorgeous mosaic, wanting to be the mayor for all the people, yet race did impact your mayoral.
Big time.
Yes.
Big time. As a matter of fact, right
Can't
here.
get around that in this country.
No, and I face it and acknowledge it. Our biggest problem, of course, was Crown Heights.
Right.
And the tragedy of Crown Heights, which is overlooked by so many well-meaning people, the real tragedy of Crown Heights is the death of Gavin Cato.
Yes.
Little black boy who was killed, his cousin was severely injured, and of course the death of Yankel Rosenbaum. He was a divinity student, Orthodox Jew from Australia, and the vehicles in a motorcade visit the Rebbe's grave, and they had done this, and a car fell behind. In an attempt to catch up, the driver lost control, hopped up on the curb, and struck these two children.
Right.
The Jewish ambulance arrived first,
Right.
and took him away really for his own safety. The ambulance had come and taken away the whites and left the black children to die. Now that wasn't true, but that's the word that went out. Resulted in a gang of young blacks stabbed Yankel Rosenbaum. He was taken to the hospital. We visited him and told he was going to be okay. He was going to survive. But the doctors had overlooked a second wound, which the ambulance attendants had noted on his record. And so anyway, he died. And so we had several days of rioting.
Right. But that was a tragedy, but I think that's symbolic of what we still have today. That you may want to say, I'm the mayor for all the people, or I'm the president for all the people. But race impacts everything we do. So how do we govern? How do you govern with integrity and with maintaining ethics, and still, as we come to a close, still with the understanding, the recognition that we live in a society constructed by race? And we'll make these your final words. What is the message you have around that?
One, it's important to understand that no principal, no chief executive, no president, no governor, no mayor gets anything done without competent women and men who are honest around him or her, assisting the cause. I had that good fortune, so we were able to do a lot of things, not because I was the tallest, smartest person, but because I had the good fortune of having a lot of very good people with me. And I think that for President Obama right now, that's what he needs more than anything else. He's got to have competent people on whom he can rely, turn to them and know they'll get the job done. And but if one seeks high office, whether it be mayor or governor or whatever, because you want to see your name in lights, you are not properly motivated.
Okay.
If you wish to hold high office in order to help others, then you are properly motivated. And if you combine that with good, competent people around you, you'll get the job done. But in closing, let me say this. I said to our staff, said, you know, I take your advice 95% of the time. But you got to understand the Lincoln Rule obtains. And they would say, well, what's the Lincoln Rule? I said, Abe Lincoln would put a question and take a vote. And they go, nay, 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 nay. Lincoln would say, the ayes have it.
Okay.
So they understood that.
They understood that. Well, thank you so much for sharing this story, the untold story, a mayor's life, a gorgeous mosaic.
You know, I had a freshman English teacher at Howard University like you.
Like me.
Oh, she was terrific.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for coming and visiting with us. And we look forward to reading and hearing more about your book. I want to tell our listening audience and our viewing audience to go out and purchase A Mayor's Life. It's a book that you can read and you put down and you pick up. It's one of those books
Well,
you
I'm
have on
glad
your
you
bedside.
enjoyed it.
I did. I really did. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. This has been Dr. Brenda Greene interviewing the Honorable Mayor David Dinkins, Writers on Writing. Please write us at writers@mec.cuny.edu. I want to thank the crew at Medgar Evers College, and come back next week.